Welcome to this series of conferences on the great figures in the early Canadian history. I would like to make a long introduction this evening, which is our first talk. A long introduction, and then in the second part, we will start laying the background to our early Canadian history, and we will look at a few of the first who discovered Canada. So first of all, some reasons for these talks in this introduction. Canada has become one of the most corrupt countries in the world, leading in all the worst kinds of immorality, euthanasia, assisted suicide, legalization of drugs. Now, I heard just yesterday, it says worldwide, like First News, Canada has legalized cannabis, abortion, the LGBT. We are also witnessing, in the last few years, the big problem with immigration. An immigration which is really a true invasion of our country, which is an immigration which is in the process of destroying our culture, our faith, our history. What makes a people is not just the culture, the language, the faith. It's all of this, but rooted in history. It is the succession of generations having this faith, this culture, this language, passing these values to their children. The logo, the motto of Quebec, as we see in our Quebec plates, is Je me souviens, lest we forget. So we remember what? Well, our patrimony, which is an interesting issue because many people try to save the buildings, but they don't understand what was behind the buildings, what made the building. It's the faith that made the buildings. And or just like now, just this week, was it our new Prime Minister, he speaks about the crucifix at Parliament. It's part of our acquired rights, nos droits acquis. But it's part of our faith. It's part of our nation, really. So it is important to know our history because history is the history of our family, of our people. And whether our families, some of us here perhaps, go back to the first generations of settlers back in the 17th centuries, whether you came along in the course of centuries or even recently, whether we speak French or English, if we live in this land, if we're Canadians, we share by virtue of the common good. We share all of its culture, all of its history, all of its greatness of the past, just as today we share the shame of its present. So this is the first set of reasons. It's important to know, if there's a systematized corruption of Canada, it's because they're replacing values that were there at the beginning, and they want to remove them. Another set of reasons for these talks, a logical consequence is the fourth commandment, honor thy father and thy mother. We need to honor the people who brought us here in this land. And it is part of the virtue of gratitude to appreciate what was done before, what our parents did, our grandparents did, our ancestors did. Why they came here. To appreciate what brought them here. And you will see in the course of these talks, we will look at this. What they wanted their children to have in this land. and what they wanted for the people they found in this land. It is important to know that, because that's why they came. For hundreds of years, for centuries, Europe did not come to these lands. But then when they came in the 16th and 17th century particularly, they came for a reason. They brought something. French Canadians have so much resources in these matters, and even I inspire myself of a lot of French historians who have written and still write about these things. But French Canadians don't know their history. English Canadians, English-speaking Canadians, know very little of what happened in the beginning, especially in the 17th century. And they have much fewer resources. They're less exposed to these stories, to these treasures. We are here in Ottawa, which is at the junction of what was called the Lower Canada and Upper Canada. Pretty much at this area here, the border of the Outaouais River. And many of these great figures that we will look at passed on this river here, the Outaouais, and went from one side to the other, like the Canadian martyrs. There were, St. John of Brebeuf was in Quebec, St. Isaac Jogues spent a few years in Montreal, and then they went to St. Mary among the Hurons, they went to Midland, they move around in this whole Huronia, and then some of them went to New York State. But these figures in this early Canadian history interest everyone. Is this common interest, really. Another reason is that studying the 17th century, which is what we're going to do, we're going to focus on the 1600s, the 17th century. It gives us beautiful example, lived examples of what we call the social kingship of Christ. Small societies that wanted Christ to reign, where the altar, where the chapel was at the center of life, where the daily mass, where the life of the village started with everybody in the chapel. Morning prayer, the mass, everybody goes to work, and everybody comes back in the evening for the evening rosary. That was the life of St. Mary among the Hurons. And the Hurons marveled at seeing the order of this Christian society. And that is wonderful. We will see also in Montreal, in Ville-Marie, we will see that our Lord was really the king of that island for many years. The story of Ville-Marie, particularly Montreal, which was called Ville-Marie, which is still called Ville-Marie in Latin, Marianopolis. Sometimes we have prayers for the priest or missals for the altar with an imprimatur of the bishop of, or the vicar general of Marianopolis, which is Ville-Marie. Polis is the city, Marianopolis, the city of Mary. And did you know, for instance, that Montreal, the foundation of Montreal, was requested by heaven? It is a man who never came to Montreal, who was in France, who had a vision of the island of Montreal, and in the vision, our Lord says, I want you to found a hospital on the island of Montreal. He did not even know where it was, because there's a Montreal in the south of France. It was a subsequent vision that told him Montreal in Canada. Oh. His name was Jérôme Le Royer de la Dauversière. He's the founder of Montreal. He never came to Canada. The father of 6 children and the founder of a religious congregation. He's the one who got Maisonneuve and Jeanne Mance and Marguerite Bourgeois to come to Montreal. And he told Maisonneuve, we'll spend a whole conference on the foundation of Ville-Marie, because it's extraordinary. He told Maisonneuve, you will build a fort at this place on the island. And there was no GPS in these days. This is 1641. So it's extraordinary. It's really an extraordinary story. And to know these stories will get us to know the motives that led them to do what they did. And it will also dispel an error which is quite common in history books. And the history of the French-Canadian civilization is quite different than in the US, for instance, which was developing at the same time. These settlers who came to Canada in the early 1600s and then up to later on, when start having then hundreds and thousands of people. The first settlers, as we're told in the modern books of history, they came primarily for the fur trade, to buy fur from the Indians and exchange them guns, whatever, alcohol, and then bring the furs to Europe. But that was, and we will see, and I will explain to you, and I will give you some quotes, that fur trade there was, for sure. But the fur trade for the main people who started these places, Champlain in Quebec or Maisonneuve in Montreal, the fur trade was a means to develop the settlements, the civilization. It was not the end. And the proof is that even when the means failed, because the fur trade was a disaster, didn't work, they still continued. So they came for another reason. And the reason was to make a Christian civilization. The real end of the foundation of Montreal, for instance, was to answer the will of God. God said, go and start a hospital, a settlement on this island in Canada. It was the will of God. And these people wanted to follow the will of God and to convert the natives. There was a clear intention of evangelization, of conversion. So it's clear among the pioneers, the very, very first. Third reasons, or third aspects of these conferences, we will dwell essentially on the 17th century, so the 1600s. Today we'll start with Jacques Cartier, a little bit in the 1500s, briefly, and then Champlain, who come in 1603, will go till about 1633, when he came back after one of his trips. There's a very close relation between what happened in Quebec and in French Canada, which was wider than Quebec in these days, okay, and France. It's parallel, obviously. We're talking about, so the beginning of 1600s, with Henry IV. We're talking about Louis XIII and Louis XIV up to 1660s. It was a very great century in France for many reasons. A century of a missionary enthusiasm, missionary zeal. It was, they were opening in, the whole of Europe was opening in Asia. They were opening here in North America, and particularly in this part. Our eight Canadian martyrs are all French. And so we're talking about third, fourth generation of Jesuits. So those who trained them when they entered as young men were trained by like the first generation of Jesuits, those who had known St. Ignatius. So there's the initial fervor of the first Jesuit. We're talking about a period, 1600 to 1660, the period of St. Francis de Sales, St. Vincent de Paul, St. John Eudes. We're going to talk about St. Margaret Mary. That's what was going on in France. Great times in these days. Great devotion to the Blessed Sacrament with the Sulpician, with Monsieur Ollier. The Sulpician, if you did not know, owned Montreal for a few years. Monsieur Ollier, among others, he was the superior of the congregation. It was a period also, and our Canadian history is, very interestingly, with Marie de l'Incarnation, Saint Mary of the Incarnation, we precede Saint Margaret Mary in the devotion to the Sacred Heart. With the Blessed Catherine of Saint Augustine in Quebec, a young nun, she was in her teenage years, we precede Saint Louis de Montfort, who came 60 years later. When we will read, we'll give a talk on both of them. When we will read their prayers, you read this, it's written in 1650. St. Louis de Montfort is 1700, 1710. You say, well, did she read the true devotion to Mary? It was not written yet. She could not have read it. But it's this, the whole, with St. John Eudes, the founder of the Eudist father, you have devotion to the Sacred Heart, devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary as well. That is starting to spread now, and that is being brought to Canada. Devotion to the Holy Family. When we will talk about Saint Francois de Laval, the first Bishop of Quebec, we'll talk about devotion to the Holy Family. That was an intimate fiber of the devotion of Canadians in the 1650s, 1660s. Devotion to the Holy Family. And even to this day, on the Feast of the Holy Family, every year in January, when we read in our breviary, they speak about how this devotion spread throughout the world, and Canada is mentioned. Canada has been one of the apostles of devotion to the Holy Family. One last reason to conclude this introduction is, as we go through these great figures and these great places where these people lived, I would like, in the course of the next 9-10 months, next year, to organize pilgrimages for the people of Ottawa, for you. Other people might want to join. At least I was thinking of 3 pilgrimages we could plan together. One is definitely in Quebec City, one in Montreal, and one in Midland, one in the Canadian Martyrs, and maybe visit other places. I will talk to you tonight about one. I doubt any of you know about it. I just discovered a few weeks ago. Okay, so we'll talk about this, but this will help you because a lot of this history is here in Ontario. A lot of it is at the border, in French Canada. I did that some years ago in Sri Lanka after speaking to the people. We are faithful in Negombo in Sri Lanka about the first bishops of Sri Lanka back in the 1840s and 50s. People did not know. And he's buried in a church over there. So next week we'll do a pilgrimage. We'll go visit the tomb of the first bishops of Colombo. And people never knew that these were championed, that they were the ones who brought the faith here. So that's a last reason, something to do as a group. We can plan it, we'll discuss that. But I think it is important that I will give you the history, but that in the course of the next month, or you can go yourselves, obviously, but we could do as a group, organize a trip on a Saturday or on a Sunday weekend, we can work out something, where we go on the actual spot where these things happen. And I think it would be just wonderful if we did that.